Okay, welcome everybody to our webinar. I'm Paul Hansbury. I'm a research fellow with the Warwick Ukraine-Belarus Hub at the University of Warwick. Today's webinar is under the title Ukraine-Belarus Relations in the Context of Lukashenka's Election. A lot of media attention over the past couple of weeks has been on the US presidential inauguration, but in the shadow of that, Mr. Lukashenka in Belarus held what he called a presidential election, though it was dismissed by his opponents as a sham, and also by many Western governments. The UK, for example, joined Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the European Union in condemning what it described as the sham election and ongoing human rights violations in Belarus. And the UK and Canada also announced coordinated sanctions at the beginning of the week. Today's webinar will ask what this so-called election means, if anything, for Ukraine-Belarus relations. Does it make Belarus any more likely to join Russia's invasion of Ukraine directly? Did Ukrainians pay any attention to the election, so-called, in Belarus at the weekend? And to discuss this topic, we have a lineup of 4 excellent speakers. I shall introduce them properly before they make their introductory remarks, but I'm pleased to have with us Alexander Shlyk, Oleh Dunda, Gwendolyn Sasse, and Pavlo Rada. So they will each have 10 minutes to make some initial remarks, and then we will go to Q&A from the audience. For the audience, a couple of notes by way of housekeeping. We do have Belarusian interpretation available on this in this webinar. Please click the globe icon at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and you should be able to access that in one of the channels there. The session is being recorded and will be uploaded to our website after the event. Whilst the speakers are talking, giving their initial remarks, the audience are welcome to put questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and these will be asked a little later on during the event. So our first speaker today is Alexander Shlyk, who is Special Advisor on Elections to Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya. From 2010, Alexander worked in the OSCE's Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, and from 2016, he was the head of the Elections Department in that organization. He has also worked on World Bank economic development projects in the past. Alexander, it would be good for you, please, to give us an outline of what happened in Belarus last weekend and how consequential or not Lukashenko's claim of a 7th term in power is. A question that often comes up in respect of Belarus and so-called elections is, why does Lukashenko bother? Perhaps you have some thoughts on that as well. You have 10 minutes, please.
Thank you very much for having me, and I'll be pleased to give you the context and describe this election so that we can have a continuation of the discussion of the subject matter in this webinar. I'll start from a very simple point. This is not the first bad election that we're witnessing in Belarus. So we all know that since 1994, there hasn't been a real democratic election in Belarus. But every election has its own peculiarities. And I will focus in my short remarks on what is different in this specific election from the previous experiences. I think the important point here, indeed, is why bother having elections at all when the results are known before the election is actually taking place? Well, any dictatorship, Belarusian dictatorship likes to follow the letter of the law. If the election is to be held, it has to be held. That's the first big reason to have an election. The second reason is for this specific election is to try and turn the page over from 2020 to re-legitimize Lukashenko, who knows that the society does not consider him the lawful ruler of the country. So this was an attempt of the regime to turn the page over, to open the new chapter, and to start engaging with the partners on the basis of the new or renewed mandate. But what is peculiar about these elections is that this election has been happening in a context that is quite different from the context of the previous elections. We now have over 1,200 political prisoners, and not everybody who is a political prisoner gets counted as such. For security reasons, some families do not want their detained relatives or family members to be declared political prisoners. The NGOs and the independent media have all been eliminated in the country and continue to work either undercover in the country or from abroad. This is different from the previous election. The other difference is this atmosphere of repression, of fear, of the intimidation that is omnipresent. And that is a context that is also quite different from the previous times. One thing that is also quite interesting about this election is that it had no challengers in the race whatsoever. If you look at the electoral programs, and we had to wait quite a bit after the campaign has formally started to actually have these programs, but if you look at them, there is no challenge. There is no point in any of the programs that any alternative candidates make to ask people to vote for them. To the point that one of the contestants actually asked the supporters to vote for Lukashenko. It's very weird when you look at this kind of a competition without any pretense of a competition whatsoever. This is what differs this election from other elections in non-democratic environments in the broader region. They simply do not even call on people to vote for them. One other interesting issue, and maybe particularly interesting for our discussion today, if you look at the programs, everybody avoided the topic of the war of aggression of Russia against Ukraine. It has not been mentioned in any of the programs. The maximum extent to which these contenders or candidates, difficult to describe them in usual terms, the biggest extent that they went into is to declare their support and allegiance to Russia, positioning themselves as the pro-Russian candidates and forces. Only Lukashenko has mentioned in his, Lukashenko and one other contestant, Gaidukevich, mentioned in their electoral programs anything to do with security. Gaidukevich clearly highlighted the need to strengthen the alliance with Russia, even further strengthen the alliance. And Lukashenko has pointed towards the geopolitical catastrophe that might be unfolding in the region. I think he knows a thing or two about catastrophes, being a handy partner for the aggressor here. One other thing that I would want to highlight about this election is that there has been an absolute disregard of any legal rules, to the point that even before the campaign started, Lukashenko basically said, well, I can do whatever. I can do campaigning in my official capacity. And there was no attempt whatsoever to even stick to the legal rules. And that did not go unnoticed by the Belarusian public. There has been quite a bit of coverage in the independent media, and in difference to the other elections, the independent media have been always and consistently highlighting that this cannot be considered an election. One other aspect that is different is that there has been a multitude of statements from the democratic countries, even before the election took place, that this should not be recognized as an electoral process, and the outcomes of this process should not be recognized as the legitimate outcomes. In the past, such statements usually appeared after the election, but in this time, many of such statements appeared even before the election took place last Sunday. maybe one last thing to highlight about this process was the atmosphere that permeated the whole process, the atmosphere of pressure and intimidation. And in a way, the regime did not achieve its major objective of turning the page over from 2020. They were not elegant in what they were doing in this election. They were brutal, they were pressuring people. There was not an attempt to even portray this as a genuine process. So they were not very successful in turning the page over. And I think that this, taken from a sort of historical perspective, we know that the elections have always been the starting and the end point in this 5-year cycles. Every single time there would be a repressive election that would be followed by massive detentions of the political opponents, who would then be in prison for a certain period of time. And then about 2.5 years before the next election, there would be a period of liberalization with these people being let go from prisons, a short period of toying with democracy and liberalization, and then another repressive election. So these 5-year cycles were always starting and ending with the election. This time around, the cycle does not work like that. And election is no longer the singular point from which things get counted in these processes. Election now has been one part in the broader arsenal of tools that Lukashenko is trying to use to have himself inserted in the possible negotiations to end the war of aggression of Russia against Ukraine. The other tools is trading in political prisoners. And another tool is sending signals to particular foreign governments, such as the US administration, for example, to also get recognition bilaterally somehow. So that in this situation, the election is not a single sort of element in this transaction. It's a part of a broader arsenal of tools that Lukashenko is using to insert himself in the possible negotiations. And with this, I think I'll conclude. I think this could be a good starting point for the next speaker.
Thank you, Alexander. That was an excellent overview of the situation. You made a comment towards the end there about Lukashenko's regime making signals to certain Western governments. And I think just on Friday before the election, Belarus released I think it was an American citizen from prison. And unless I'm mistaken, and I'm fully accept I may be, I haven't seen any statement from the US State Department about the elections in Belarus on Sunday, unlike the joint statement that the UK, EU, and others put out.
On the release, yes, there has been a release of a US citizen. Actually, she is a dual citizen. And if I remember correctly, she has been in the pre-trial detention, so the proceedings have been stopped and she was let go. That is one of the clear signals towards the US administration that they're ready to engage. The second broad signal was the airing of the interviews with 4 journalists who are now serving their terms in prison. And these 4 journalists have been or are affiliated with the Radio Free Europe, the US media outlet. Why these, and plus another US citizen has also aired the interview. So this selection of the people with connections to the United States and showing them, having them speak in the interviews is also a signal to the US administration. With regard to the statements from the US, Secretary of State Blinken released the statement before the election and before the inauguration of President Trump, declaring the elections in Belarus as a sham process, not recognizing the outcome or the process as such. As per normal, I'm not sure it's normal practice, but as per what people say this happens, the statement has been archived away from the White House webpage. So at the moment, it looks like there is no statement, but there has been a statement by the State Department, by Secretary of State Blinken, before the election.
Yes, thank you for the correction on that and for the extra information for our audience. So that gives us the context for where Belarus is right now. Our next speaker, Oleh Dunda, is a member of the Ukrainian Parliament, where he sits as a member of the Servant of the People Party. He is also a member of the State Administration Committee. Oleg, we're now soon to enter the fourth year since Russia's large-scale invasion of Ukraine. Do you think that Belarus's role in the war will change in the months ahead? Belarus has been indirectly involved and recognized as a co-aggressor by international organizations. Will it become a direct combatant? You have 10 minutes, please.
If I have possibility to short answer, I would disagree with this statement. I don't reconcile Belarus like a part of this war in a full term. But first of all, Paul, it's very important question. But first of all, I would greetings to all, especially you, for your invitation to this webinar on the topic of the past presidential election in Belarus. And in fact, the reappointment of Lukashenko as the head of the federal district of Belarus within Russian under empire. Actually, presidential elections in Belarus in 2020 and 2025 have formed threats for the nearest future in the Baltic region and directly in Belarus itself. And this event shouldn't be underestimated. I spoke yesterday with my colleagues from Warsaw, from Sejm, and they are very concerned about the result of another coronation of Lukashenko. Not the falsified results of election, of course, but the grave silence that accompanied the expression of will in 26th of January. Let me make a small excursion into history of that issues. Let's start with the elections of the 2020. Everyone, of course, everyone remembers the size and degree of protest at these elections. Also, there was spontaneous and unorganized. But they showed the whole world that there is a rather large proactive part of the Belarusian society, which is ready to fight against the decrepit and bored dictators. But only the leaders of so-called opposition weren't ready for such a development and actually led the protest to defeat by the inactivity. It's quite possible that most of leadership is opposite of the opposition didn't ever try to fight the power, of course. In fact, all this was very reminiscent of the events of 2011, 2012 in Moscow on Bolotnaya Square. Like then in Moscow, this protest moods of Belarusian became a big surprise for everybody. These events directly influence the further development of the situation in 2022 and beyond. First of all, Lukashenko was forced to surrender his statehood to the Kremlin's pawnship and to become something like a Moscow-appointed Governor General of the Belarusian Republic, so retaining the formal signs of independent state, but with full economic and military dependence on Moscow. Moreover, now Lukashenko often acts as a copy of Maria Zakharova with mustache and voices speeches right in Moscow, which for various reasons official spokesman of the Russian regime can't voice. For example, Putin flattered Trump last week, but at the same time, Lukashenko on Sunday, yes, 26th of January, Lukashenko publicly addressing to the European Union with a proposal to abandon its dictate. All these threats from Belarus with Oreshniki and other nuclear weapons. In the second place, the 2020 protest closed off opportunities for Belarus to become more deeply involved in Russia's war against Western democracy. It's why I don't reconcile the Belarusian citizen like a part of this war. Ukraine, we know, is the key part of the theater of operation of this war. Belarus is still standing aside for one simple reason. One. It's very important. Neither Moscow nor Minsk can be fully confident in the obedience of Belarusian society. And the events of 2022 proved the validity of such fears. There were so many manifestations of forceful resistance in Belarus. And Ukrainians can only be grateful to Belarusians who, risking their freedom and lives, came out to the protest in 2020. Minsk and Moscow together, not just Minsk. Minsk and Moscow together choose very simple option to solve this problem. They followed a path similar to the Kremlin's actions in 2012, 2015 in relation to the protest on Bolotnaya Square. It's squeezing out the proactive part of society to Europe with simultaneous imprisonment, the most desperate. The goal was to plunge Belarusian society into a state of apathy and submission towards the Russian occupants, so that not even shadow of possibility of protest existed. There should be no unreliable population in the rear of the empire. And Lukashenko's loyalty to the wars from Moscow after 2022 couldn't be doubted. That is why Warsaw was so watching the events of 6 January 2025 so closely. Not the result, but the would-be protests. And 26 January showed that the task was achieved. Belarusian society is apathetic and passive. The same is confirmed by sociological researches conducted under auspices of Chatham House. So, what are Warsaw and Vilnius afraid of? Belarus occupies an important strategic location in the region. Any Russian military pressure on the NATO eastern flank is impossible without using Belarus as a springboard. From Belarus, it's possible to conduct operation in the northeast of Poland, in the areas of Vilnius and Daugavpils. At the same time, one shouldn't underestimate Russia's capabilities. Modern warfare is not about tanks and mechanized units like it was the Second World War. Even it isn't often about artillery. It's drone war of various kinds with use of modern logistics. And it's impossible to provide a bridgehead for invasion of European Union without obedient Belarus. Probably it's why the elections were postponed to January in order to speed up the military operation and accordingly to test society's ability to resist by elections in advance. Apart from elections, no other sociological instrument can show this ability. I apologize for such a gloom picture in the future, but I will try to add some optimism. Lukashenko regime has not support of the society and holds on only on Russia, bayonets and financing. We have recently seen somewhat similar situation in Syria 2 months ago. The dictatorial regime of Bashar Assad fell without even trying to defend itself. Even the military contingent of Russia didn't stand up in defense of the ruler of Damascus, who cowardly fled to Moscow. In case of a revolt of Belarusian and march of armed rebels to Minsk, with support from outside, of course, nobody in Belarus will defend the regime. The apathetic society will gratefully accept the new power with hope for a bright future. Therefore, the problem of Belarusian bridgehead for invasion into Europe can be solved only the Syrian way, just Syrian way. And there are possibilities for it. Живе Belarus.
Thank you, Oleg. You've drawn quite a solid division between regime and society in Belarus in your remarks there. And I think that's leads in quite nicely into some of what Professor Sasse will be able to tell us about, because she she is an expert on public opinion and social attitudes. So thank you for your remarks. Sorry, introduction. So next up we will have Gwendolyn Sasse, who is the director of the Center for East European and International Studies, ZOiS, in Berlin, which is an independent research institute focused on social science research in the region in Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe. She is also Einstein Professor for the Comparative Study of Democracy and Authoritarianism at Humboldt University in Berlin. She was previously a professor at the University of Oxford, and her most recent book is Russia's War Against Ukraine, which was published by Polity in 2023. I got a little bit ahead of myself before I introduced you, but Gwendolyn, please, can you tell us something about the social and political attitudes of Ukrainians? Have there been any changes in how society in Ukraine views Belarusians since the beginning of the large-scale invasion? And also, just before I hand the floor to you, I will remind our audience that we welcome questions in the Q&A. I can see there's a couple there already. Please do put your questions into the Q&A to all of our speakers. Gwendolyn, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much, Paul, for your kind introduction and for involving me in this discussion. I have to say up front, I will be referring not to my own research on this subject, which I have simply not conducted in this detail or systematically, but there is research out there on that, and I will refer to that, because I think leading on from where we just ended off in terms of the distinction between regime and society in Belarus, I think the picture we get from opinion polls in Ukraine is quite straightforward, and it suggests that distinction is currently not made, and that's, I think, not surprising in the current context. But what I want to emphasize is, and that's where the real change is, that in the past views were relatively positive. I mean, it always depends on the kind of questions you ask, but also cross border sort of linkages were close. But currently, the picture, or not quite currently, I looked at a survey I find very interesting in this regard to ask about social distance in terms of various groups in society. And the Kiev International Institute of Sociology conducts this survey regularly, or adds this question to its surveys regularly. And the last one that was released was from early 24, and so I'm assuming a new one is in the making, but the one from last year is already very telling, and there's not much that suggests that these figures should at least, let's say, improve in any way. So then what do we mean? What do they mean by social distance? They ask in this repeat survey sort of how willing would you be to have a member of a certain ethnic group as a member of your family, as a close friend, as a work colleague, as a resident of Ukraine, as a guest in Ukraine, and I would not let them even into Ukraine is the bottom end. And that creates a scale between 1 and 7 in the end. And the data from late 23, October 23, that was reported then in early 24, suggests that Belarusians are second last on that list, a relatively long list. And the only other group that's lower is Russians resident in Russia. So even Russians resident in Ukraine are slightly higher. So the index there is 5.3. That's fairly bad. If you think it's 1 to 7, Russian resident in Russia, just over 6 at that point, 6.3, I think it was. So the exact numbers, I think, as always, I think are less interesting, and maybe one can't, what does that mean exactly, that kind of scale, but it gives a clear trend, a clear tendency. As a footnote to just that, if you look at the long list of sort of groups mentioned, then it's telling that clearly there is a foreign policy dimension to it, because in 2023, for example, already the year before as well, also, for example, Canadians, Germans, French, and so on, Americans feature prominently. So that clearly is also filtered through kind of the perspective of the war and where support is coming from. So these are not all sort of groups massively represented in Ukrainian society itself. But the interesting thing there is to just highlight how big the shift is. I mean, as Keith has tracked this over the years, like, for example, let's go back to 2013. And there the Belarusians are number 4 down the list. And they are number 4 because it's separated into Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians, Russian-speaking Ukrainians. Then it was Russians in Russia 3rd, and Belarusians 4th. So this is a dramatic change over time, but of course the big change comes in 2022. Various other surveys show, even in 2021, that a majority, depending on how the questions are asked, has positive, very positive, relatively positive views of Belarusians. If we add another survey to that from October 24 by the Razumkov Center, then we also find some stark results that 80% said in that survey, where I don't have a kind of exact overview of the range of questions, sort of just some results that are a bit taken out of context, which is always a bit problematic. But 80% say they are in favor of severing ties with Belarus. They mean diplomatic ties. 78% said that they see Belarus as a party to the war. And also close to 70% favor a total ban on Belarusians entering Ukraine. So these are pretty stark statements. Of course, however you frame the statements, you also get the responses. So again, I just highlight, as I always do, and in particular in crisis or war settings, to be careful with the exact number, but the trend, I think, couldn't be clearer, that there has been this big shift and that the war dominates, and how could it not be dominating? And it's clear what not Belarusian society, but the Belarusian regime did, and also to enable the start of the full-scale invasion. And so while I think underneath, and that was also when I conducted some survey work in Belarus around the mass protests, there was a clear I think understanding of many, I can't put a figure to it, in Ukrainian society of what was happening in Belarus, and immediate comparisons were drawn with obviously the repeated cycles of mass mobilization in Ukraine. So behind these stark figures that I just presented, there is a deeper understanding of what society was trying to do and failed to do, unlike Ukraine, through repeated cycles of mass protest. But this, quite frankly, is not, and this also, I think, through anecdotal evidence, both at societal and elite level, what is just obvious, that it's not a priority right now to worry about what Belarusian society thinks. I think one can go kind of one step in that direction. Not only is there no distinction between Belarusian regime and society, it's also just, quite frankly, not a priority to think about the clear distinctions and about thinking about Belarusian society as such. So I think these views, although perceptions can always shift, and can shift, as we see here, dramatically through dramatic events, it's not so easy to see how they are not fixed, of course, forever like this, but it's also hard to see how they can become more malleable again and how they can change. So something fairly big or something really long-term would have to happen. And what is that? And short of course, a lot depends on the outcome of the war, but also short of change in Russia, it's quite hard to see how, through a kind of trickle-down effect, there would be a change of these perceptions anytime soon. So this distinction, society and regime, is not really there. And when will society really re-emerge again in perceptions as something that one needs to even really think about from a Ukrainian point of view, or make these distinctions? I cannot really quite foresee that that's happening anytime soon. And maybe I end with kind of, which was already sort of mentioned or alluded to as well, that obviously there was a strong reaction by the Ukrainian government, clearly calling these sort of sham elections a farce. But what would have been noticed, I don't know by how many in Ukraine, is the contradictions in Lukashenko's own words, and is on the one hand, right after the so-called elections, saying he has no regrets in terms of what he enabled Putin to do in Ukraine, but also before playing on peace and stability in his rhetoric, and also obviously somehow eyeing for a position or maybe the place again that hosts some sort of negotiations, but that from a Ukrainian point of view, elites in society cannot be serious at all. So it's not that's not something that I think could change any kind of perceptions. And what people will be aware of and are aware of, that Belarus and Russia are planning new massive joint military exercises. And the last time that happened, that was the precursor to the full-scale invasion. So unfortunately, I think I end in an even gloomier place than the previous speaker.
Okay, thank you, Gwendolyn. Gloom everywhere. You said you made an interesting comment that began short of change in Russia, and I think the implication was that nothing's going to change in perceptions until of Belarusians until change has happened in Russia. And I would just use that as an opportunity to plug one of the webinars later in our series which has got the title Change in Belarus Without Change in Russia, and where we will explore whether or not Belarus, the likelihood and possibilities of change in Belarus without something seismic happening in Russia or significant happening in Russia. You also mentioned, I think if I understood correctly, that 78% of Ukrainians see Belarus as a party in the war. Something that connects to is this idea that Lukashenka is angling for a role in negotiations about a peace settlement over what happens in ending the war in Ukraine. And what is quite interesting, looking at Chatham House surveys of Belarusians, is that although no one in Ukraine or in most of the world would believe the idea that Belarus can be neutral, inside Belarus itself, it would seem that there are a number of people who buy into the idea that Lukashenko has kept them out of the war and that they are a neutral player. And that's something that Pavlo might pick up on when he brings us his remarks. So our final speaker today is Pavlo Rada, who is an analyst in the Russian and Belarusian Studies program at the Foreign Policy Council Ukrainian Prism. His research interests include the activities of the Belarusian Democratic Forces, the domestic and foreign policy of Belarus, and the country's relations with Russia, the European Union, and Ukraine. Belarus's relations with Russia, the European Union, and Ukraine. Pavlo, can you tell us something about how Ukraine has responded diplomatically to recent events in Belarus? We heard from the previous speaker that the Ukrainian government has condemned the sham election. Can we expect to see any change in the political and diplomatic relationship over the coming months and year? You have 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for having me. Yeah, that's true. The Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs has officially condemned the so-called elections in Belarus and expressed its support for those Belarusians who continue to fight for democracy and freedom in their country. There also been some condemnation from the Ukrainian MPs, including the parliamentary group for Democratic Belarus, who even called on the Ukrainian and European governments to hold any diplomatic, economic, and any ties with the Lukashenko regime. It is obvious right now that Ukraine will not recognize Alexander Lukashenko as a legitimate president of the Republic of Belarus in the next months and in years. It is unlikely that Ukrainian politicians will re-establish any sort of regular contacts with both Lukashenko and his establishment. But at the same time, we should not expect any changes also in the diplomatic dimension. We all know that both Ukraine and Belarus have recalled their ambassadors. The Belarusian side even evacuated its embassy from Kyiv in the beginning of 2022, while Ukrainian diplomatic presence in Belarus was reduced just to 5 persons who are still working there. However, I do not expect Ukraine to cut off diplomatic relations with Belarus because they are quite needed, especially in terms of humanitarian goals, because Belarus serves as one of the possible roads Ukrainians from the occupied territories can get back to Ukraine. And also, Belarus is a territory where Ukrainian and Russian sides are conducting the exchange of prisoners of war. So that is basically the main reason why Ukraine still preserves diplomatic relations with Belarus. And I believe Ukraine will preserve it unless Lukashenko decides to embark on extremely aggressive actions towards Ukraine. However, I do not think that it's possible, especially taking into consideration the fact that the Russians decided to involve the North Korean troops into the Russo-Ukrainian war rather than its CSTO and Union State ally, I mean Belarus. It has also been mentioned about our previous speakers that Lukashenko is willing to participate in the possible negotiations over the end of the Russo-Ukrainian war, and that's absolutely true. Even the fact that Belarus is somehow involved in the exchange of prisoners of war is partial success for the regime, and they're trying, and they will be trying to enhance it even more. So, for example, when we are talking about possible negotiations and about the possible role of Belarus, we have been scanning regular signals and direct statements from the Belarusian elites that Belarus should be included in those possible negotiations and that Belarus should be provided with some sort of security guarantees. Belarus has also been conducting several events and conferences. So, for example, in autumn 2024, they conducted the second international conference on aviation security, which was attended in particular by the foreign minister of Hungary, Szijjártó. And that these events and that these conferences are important for Belarus not only as a tool of portraying the country as some sort of peacemaker, but also as an indicator that Belarus and the Belarusian elites are willing to step even further. It's quite possible that these initiatives can be also supported by the Russian side. And despite the fact that the Russians have been showing no interest in direct and normal dialogue with the Ukrainian side, the Belarusian negotiation platform that the Lukashenko regime is trying to restore is potentially the safest option for Moscow in case of negotiations. That is the most loyal and the safe option for Vladimir Putin outside of Russia. And that's also maybe one of the reasons why the Lukashenko regime is trying to insert himself into the negotiations between Ukrainian and Russian side. Also, I would like to touch upon a little bit about the question of what to expect in a more long-term perspective. The fact that Lukashenko has re-elected himself, of course, is gloomy, and that is the reality. But at the same time, we should also ask ourselves about the question, what will be happening with Belarus after Lukashenko? So what will be happening with the country if, for example, the vacuum of power emerges in case of Lukashenko's death or something else? I do not believe that in the next years, Lukashenko will be able to conduct the transit of power, because in order to do so, he needs to have absolutely safe environment both internally and externally. However, we are seeing that the situation in our region is pretty difficult and it's changing, and I'm not sure whether Lukashenko will have several months to prepare himself for the transit of power. So that is the question we both in Ukraine and in European countries should ask ourselves: what to do with Belarus and how we can potentially react to the emergence of the vacuum of power in the country, and how we can act in order to prevent Belarus from falling into the Russian hands completely. And I'll stop at this point.
Okay, thank you very much, Pavlo. Yeah, I mean, there are some questions there about the future that we have been thinking about long, even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So we'll now turn to questions from the audience. We have a few. There are some. I would say they are mildly provocative. So I'll start. I have a question that, and to the audience, please do add questions for our speakers. We have a question for Oleg and Pavlo, which is, do you agree that all citizens of Belarus bear collective responsibility for Russia's war against Ukraine to the same extent as all citizens of the Russian Federation? The person asking the question adds that in Davos, Ukrainian officials made a statement about the collective responsibility of Russians for the war. Oleh, do you want to? You almost touched on that.
Maybe I will be first.
Yep.
Thank you, Roman. Thank you, Roman, for these questions. But I didn't read any statement from Ukrainian official about this. But I think I answered for this question in my speeches. I would disagree with this statement. Belarusian citizens have responsibility for this war. But because I don't reconcile like Belarusian, it's full participant of this war on the Russian boards. But it can change after these elections.
Okay, thank you. And Pavlo, would you like to add anything to that reply?
Yeah, actually, I would disagree with such a statement because, to my point of view, Belarusians do not bear collective responsibility. And if we say that, we mean that Belarusians are different from the Russians. Because for the last several years, there been a tendency to mix Belarusians and Russians and to think that basically these two nations are almost the same and that both Russians and Belarusians are mutually responsible for the Russian aggression against Ukraine. But to my point of view, that is different. Belarusians are different in terms of their worldview, they are different in terms of their values, they are different in terms of their actions. So Belarusians do not bear collective responsibility for Russia's aggression against Ukraine.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a question for Gwen. You made quite a lot of comments on the way that questions are asked affects the answers, which is a very agreeable statement. It brings to mind a clip from the British sitcom Yes, Minister, where the special advisor is talking to the minister about reintroducing conscription, and the minister's position is absolutely adamant, and then a series of questions lead him to the inevitable answer that, of course, it would be stupid to do X, which is the opposite of his starting position. And it's a very effective way of showing how questions affect answers. But my question is actually about who is being surveyed in some of these, in the polling you refer to of Ukrainians. Are there any surveys that you're aware of that are reaching people in the occupied territories of Ukraine? And do we know anything about opinion there, and does it differ very much from the opinion in the bulk of Ukraine? I also have in mind Crimea. I mean, you are an expert on Crimea. You wrote a book on Crimea. I don't know if more recently you have been able to conduct any research in Crimea, but I'd be interested to hear your any comments you have on that.
Yeah, to answer that quickly, no, for many years I have not been able to do any kind of research in Crimea, and I wouldn't have attempted it. In recent years, these data and any also opinion polls, also the ones that so I'm involved in, only in quotation marks, that's hard enough, survey in territories under Ukrainian control. So occupied territories are not included in this. And it also makes, one has to say that, the comparison over time messier. No? So I didn't have time to go into this now, but in 2013, there's a different population, a different sample involved than in 2023. And one can also see that some views are therefore maybe less prominent or more prominent. And survey agencies, different ones now estimate, but it's hard to see exactly if one and on what basis one would really say, again, it's that exact figure that the sampling error is on the error overall is bigger. But they estimated usually still between sort of 2 and just over 3%. That's a bigger margin, but it's still, all things considered, maybe surprisingly low for what's happening in Ukraine. But yeah, so that only ever it excludes the occupied territories, and I am not aware of any, and I couldn't imagine how one could do this now systematically, survey in occupied territories. I think sort of the only trustworthy agency in Russia doing this, Levada, I've not seen anything specifically on occupied territories, but if at some point, then maybe it could be through them. But there, even the interpretation of the results under the impressions of occupation are almost impossible to interpret, I would think. And again, however, I would think that also there other issues are much more important than views on Belarus at this point. So it probably also not a real indicator of anything sort of that really mattered to the local population most of all, I would think. In the past, it was, and also before 2022, it was with different agencies, sometimes Ukrainian, sometimes Levada, sometimes an international one, not based anywhere, to do some polling in the occupied territories in Donbass. And I've been involved in projects like that, also not unproblematic in how one interprets it, how one implements it, and so on, but we've tried different surveys with different companies to piece it together in different ways. But we didn't ask specifically there about views of Belarus, but one could definitely see over time, whoever surveyed, kind of the impact that occupation has, and that not as fast as some people think, but then that at least the responses get more adjusted to what the Russian regime is trying to achieve. But that's not an answer about now. I'm not aware of anybody who can do this kind of research, and also people also obviously also in the rest of Ukraine move, so it's different people in different locations, so also these interpretations of how sort of, for example, in the past, different regions thought about certain issues. This is also quite a different picture in parts. So yeah, so the short answer is no to the question of systematic knowledge about occupied territories, but then we probably wouldn't expect major surprises if one could actually do it.
Yes, thank you. The issue of the matter of issue salience is important, and how salient would the issue of views of Belarusians be of those living in the occupied regions. I suppose one thing that throws up in the mind is the question of the deportation of children taken away from families and the re-education camps, something that Belarus has been involved in, and indeed there is a question from one of the audience about war crimes and Mr. Lukashenka. But we will move to a question. Well, I'm coming to you, Alex, with a question, so you will have a chance to say what you want as well, because I'm also conscious the question I'm going to ask is maybe a little bit outside of your area of expertise. But it's a question which reads as follows: over the decades, the Belarusian ruler has managed to create a large and effective repressive apparatus. This apparatus is interested in the preservation of the authoritarian regime. They have no other prospects other than repression. It is known that even mass popular protests cannot defeat armed criminals. Does this mean that internal factors cannot change the situation inside Belarus? Is the external factor of decisive importance?
It's an interesting question. I think it demands an answer or a short explanation of how this repressive apparatus functions and what is it premised upon. First and foremost, it's not ideological. There is no such thing as the ideology in Belarus that the repressive apparatus is following. They're not following a particular political course of action that is pursued by Lukashenko. It is the motivation for the repressive apparatus is purely financial. It's access to the resources. It is such as, for example, getting an apartment when you serve for a certain period of time, but that place of living doesn't belong to the officer in the repressive apparatus. The moment they step away from their functions, they lose their livelihoods. There are certain benefits for the retired members of the repressive apparatus. There are certain, but the financial motivation is primary in how this functions. That is why we can also say that the regime is sustained by the financial inflows, be that the trade with Russia or the trade with the West. Whatever is the money, it is primarily spent on maintaining the repressive apparatus, but and then secondarily on all other things such as education, healthcare, and you name it. So the repressive apparatus is the #1 budget line. But this doesn't fully guarantee that the repressive apparatus would be on the same page with the regime. The events in February 2022, in the very first days of the Russian full-scale invasion, have demonstrated that the repressive apparatus is not unified on this. They did not see this aggression as justified. They're not different from the society in this. And I'll get to the latest data on the public attitudes towards the Russian aggression. But the military in Belarus was not going to support any active involvement in the war in Ukraine because they, first and foremost, they know that they're not capable of engaging and they do not want to die. Secondly, they simply do not see that aggression as theirs. There is no ideological link between the Belarusian system and the Russian system in this regard. The Belarusian society and the government apparatus does not buy into the mantra of the Russian Federation of the collective West being there to destroy to destroy Russia. This is not bought by the government apparatus in Belarus as well. And as I said, they're not different from the society as a whole. And the latest data that I've just downloaded, it's the Chatham House Belarus initiative on polling. It has demonstrated that in December 2024, very recently, just now, there is virtually no change in the attitude of Belarusians towards this military action of Russia against Ukraine over the 2.5 years or 3 years that the war is happening. And the latest shows 32% either definitely support or somewhat support Russia, whereas 40% somewhat do not support or definitely do not support. And what is interesting is that the definitely do not support is the whole 27% of the society. And that is quite significant. I think that view is very, very closely held. And if you look at the assessment of the same polling on categorization of the society into pro-government, neutrals, democratic leaning, you will see that no matter how you calculate and no matter what assumptions you make, the number of people who do not support Russia is much higher than whoever can be characterized as pro-democratic. So the view, the pro-Ukrainian position is taken even by those who do not proactively embrace the democratic ideals. So I think this is a good base where to start the rebuilding and the reconstruction of the country, because this is a much more unifying topic than many other topics that are highlighted in the polling. And I will stop here.
Thank you, Alex. We have one area that we haven't that hasn't come up in the discussion so far, I think, is the relationship between Ukraine and the democratic forces, specifically around Tsikhanouskaya's office. And so this is a question that perhaps all of the panel might have a view on. How we had a lot of gloom. Maybe there is some optimism here, I'm not sure. But how do the panel see the relationship between the Ukrainian government and the Belarusian democratic movement developing? There is, in the way the question from the floor, from the audience, has referred to ties, economics and trade, some business ties between the Lukashenka regime and Ukraine. I don't know about those, so I won't say them aloud, but the panel can read the question as it was written. Perhaps Pavlo, can we start with you? Do you think that the Ukrainian government position towards democratic movement is changing at all? Are there and in what way? You did mention when you were talking the pragmatic need for maintaining ties with the Lukashenko regime, even without diplomatic, the high-level diplomatic recognition.
Well, Ukraine's relations with the Belarusian democratic forces and Belarusian democratic movement stems from the lack of clear vision towards what we can and what we should achieve together with the Belarusian democratic environment. So we should separate different centers of the Belarusian democratic movement, for example, the Kalinowski regiment or the office of Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya. In the beginning of the large-scale invasion, there was a trend when Ukrainian MPs and Ukrainian politicians were trying to present the Kalinowski regiment as the only possible partner within the Belarusian democratic movement. However, now we do not see such an active rhetorics, and we do not see any sort of activities in terms of cooperation with the Kalinowski regiment, which actually means that partially Ukrainian side has given up on this idea and is not pushing this narrative anymore. When it comes to the office of Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya and her circle, we need to understand that Ukraine's position towards partnerships with other players is pretty pragmatic. And Ukraine is sometimes instrumentalizing the relations with other partners. So if a certain player can provide us with money or weapons or any sort of significant support, then we are ready to cooperate with them. However, Belarusian democratic forces cannot provide any sort of military support or financial support because they also need it. The second reason why Ukraine refrains from active cooperation with Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya is that Ukrainian political elites and the Belarusian regime possibly have established some sort of mutually acceptable actions, both sides. So Ukraine refrains from cooperation with Tsikhanouskaya. Lukashenko is not directly involved in the war, and Belarusian soil is not used anymore for attacks against Ukraine. And there is a status quo that has been maintained since September 2022 and is likely to be maintained in the next months. So, and the third most important reason that I mentioned in the beginning, and I would like to mention once again, is that Ukraine does not have a clear vision and clear strategy towards Belarus. The question of Belarus is not on the political agenda. Ukrainian elites are mostly preoccupied with the questions of defending the country and the questions of establishing cooperation with new American administration, with ensuring that the financial and military support will be provided. So these are the main questions Ukrainian elites are preoccupied with, and the issue of Belarus is fading away against this background.
Okay, thank you. Alex, would you like to add anything to that?
Just two quick points. I fully agree with Pavlo that this is a very pragmatic relationship between the Ukrainian establishment and the Belarusian democratic forces. It is pragmatic on both sides. We operate on the premise that we should do no harm. We do not want to earn any symbolic benefits of closer relations with Ukraine at the cost of any issues faced later by the Ukrainian partners. We totally understand it, and we are very pragmatic in this as well. The second thing is that we all know that Ukraine is facing more difficult discussions right now, particularly in multilateral fora and in some of the bilateral conversations as well. This has changed. I'm speaking to you from Strasbourg in the context of the session of Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. And it is a slightly different climate with regard to, positions taken by the Ukrainian delegation, amendments proposed, language used. And what we are doing in the multilateral fora is that we throw our support whenever we can and the capital that we have in these multilateral fora to the support of our Ukrainian partners. So this is also happening. It's not as easy for the Ukrainian delegates to convince everybody to use proper language, to take proper policy positions. And this is where our accumulated capital is also helpful. And this is where we do our best to support. It doesn't have to be, symbolic at the highest level. The actual work is being done at the different levels as well.
Okay, thank you. Coming off of that point, the question and the whole answer.
Can I add some point about this question?
Yes.
Thank you, Paul. I already mentioned that opposition forces of Belarus and Russia in exile are very similar. Very similar. Their strategy is quite simple: to wait for Ukraine's victory without making any of their own investment in this struggle. However, this approach doesn't work, except Kalinovsky's regiments. Therefore, everything is in the hands of Belarusian opposition. They need to reconcile their role in the ongoing war, take on responsibilities and functions. That's all on the Belarusian side. Thank you.
Okay, I was going to come to you with a question, which I think we can probably infer your answer to. The question was going to be about the attitude inside Ukraine of giving the Belarusian democratic forces a place at the table in negotiations over settlement negotiations. I think your answer is clearly going to be that they shouldn't be given that seat at the table. If you disagree, then the next question is coming to you as well, so you can address that. But I'm going to ask what I think is a slightly provocative question. It refers to some comments you made last year at the Free Russia Forum about Ukraine taking military operations into Belarus, and it draws the analogy to the Kursk region, and it also says. Refers to the success of the operation in the Kursk region and recent territorial claims expressed by Mr. Kuleba, former Minister of Foreign Affairs, who said that Gomel, Brest and Mogilev regions are Ukrainian lands. Do you want to comment on that, Oleg?
Thank you, Paul.
That's a no thank you, Paul,
I saw these questions. It's very interesting question. So first of all, Ukrainian forces, Ukrainian officials never had any statement about annex Kursk region or another region in Russia. The same situation with Belarusian regions. We are not occupants. We don't have any requests for Belarusian region for Belarusian territory. What I said in Vilnius, it's all was about defense strategy. Our official and unofficial position in Ukraine, Belarus need to be sovereignty independent country and friendly country for Ukraine, and we don't have any desires to have some Belarusian soils. Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Gwen, just to put you on the spot a little bit here, you may be that you don't have data, but have there been any public opinion surveys that you're aware of concerning what has happened in Ukraine concerning these questions of Ukrainian, well, anything from drone strikes to cross-border incursions, which we've seen a lot of and increasing over the past couple of years. Is that a question that's been asked of Ukrainians at all, and what are the findings, if you're familiar?
Yes, thank you. I'm not aware of at least sort of publicly available surveys asking this and in this detail. But on the other hand, I wouldn't be surprised if this question gets asked. But maybe it's not necessary to ask it even in surveys. So it's part of a different kind of maybe place of strategy making. Yeah, so it's hard to venture a guess, but in line with what I think many of us have said now, I think whatever is deemed sort of necessary to continue this war and bring it to a point, if end is the right word, would be acceptable. So, and also not the main concern of Ukrainian society and the Ukrainian political elites, military elites would not be, I think, the same at all, and cannot be the same risk calculation that you always see in other parts of Europe or the West. So, so if there was such a survey, which I'm not aware of, if it was possible to ask it, whatever is necessary to do these types of actions that would change the war dynamics, I could imagine support. But I'm not aware of any data backing this that is publicly available. At the same time, I think the focus is on Russia, and the question is more, and would there be similar types of actions, military actions elsewhere, in addition to Kursk? But so I think the focus is on Russia. But in terms of perception, that's a different thing from what a government or military would actually do. So I think perception-wise, that would also be justified. But in terms of how likely it is, I think many other things could be possible in Russia with particular support of it.
Okay, thank you. So we have asked all of the questions that have come from the audience. I think this has been a rich discussion. It's certainly been highly informative. There has been some gloom. But I think it's been a good webinar to start what is a new series of webinars that we are hosting over the coming 6 months. I will be writing a short policy brief document based on this discussion, which will be uploaded to our Warwick Ukraine-Belarus Hub website hopefully in the next 2 or 3 weeks, warwick.act.uk/WUB Hub. Previous policy briefs based on previous webinars are available there. Also, before I thank our speakers, let me just say that we also have a blog on our website as an open invitation to speakers and also to people in the audience. If you're interested in writing for us, please do get in touch with me. Happy to consider proposals for blogs. And we will have our next webinar on the 26th of February, when we will discuss a topic that has been a bit of a leitmotif through today's discussion, which is peace negotiations. And I can't remember the title off the top of my head. Negotiated settlement, peace settlement, what does it mean for Ukraine and Belarus? So we will be revisiting some of the issues that have come up in this discussion very much. That leaves me to thank our audience for joining us, the two interpreters who have been working tirelessly throughout the call, and especially hugely grateful to our four panelists for giving us their time and their insights on this very important topic. So I hope that they will that we will see them again at future events. And the very last thing is to thank our partners, Ukrainian Prism. Pavlo is here from Ukrainian Prism, but Ukrainian Prism, and also the Stockholm Centre for East European Studies, who we are cooperating with on organising events and such forth. So thank you, everybody, and we hope to see you again very soon.